Have you ever wondered what you would do if you discovered your own parents were quietly plotting to harm you, not out of anger, but out of desperation, debt, and greed? That's what happened to me one Christmas. When a simple box of handmade chocolates, something meant to feel warm and festive, turned out to be the first clue in a plan that could have ended my life. Before I tell you how everything unraveled, can you tell me? You're listening to this story from where? And at what time? I'd love to know how far my voice is reaching tonight. My name is Elise Hart. And if you ever grew up as the reliable one, the one adults praised not out of love, but because it saved them effort, then you already know the shape of my childhood. The Hart family looked respectable from the outside, middle class, educated, polite at neighborhood gatherings, but inside our house was a quiet hierarchy, carved so deeply into the walls that even now, in my 30s, I can still feel its outline whenever I run my fingers along old memories. My father, Thomas Hart, used to be a respected surgeon in Tacoma. People in town spoke his name with admiration, but I mostly remember him as a man who came home exhausted, frustrated, and short-tempered, carrying the weight of every mistake he feared he might make. After leaving the hospital system under circumstances no one fully explained to me, he opened a small private clinic that struggled almost immediately. Debt accumulated like mildew under a sink, slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. My mother, Diane, was a retired schoolteacher whose entire identity rested on being the mother of a perfect daughter. Unfortunately, that daughter was not me. It was my sister, Lana, the golden child, the sparkling center of every family photograph, the one who was always held up as proof that my parents had done something right. When Lana divorced at 28 and moved back home with her 2 kids, our parents welcomed her like a hero returning from war. "She's been through so much," they would whisper tenderly, while in the same breath reminding me that I didn't have children, didn't need help, didn't need attention. "You're strong, Elise. You've always been strong." Strength, in our house, was less a compliment and more a sentence. It meant I handled my emotions alone. I handled my injuries alone. I handled myself alone. From as early as I can remember, I had been labeled the independent one, smart, mature, responsible, doesn't need anyone. When a child is praised that way, adults pat themselves on the back as if they raised a prodigy, but what it really means is that the child has learned to survive without being noticed. I learned to pack my own lunches, treat my own fevers, braid my own hair before school, and calm my own nightmares. Nothing was ever said out loud, but every pattern repeated until it settled into my bones. Lana was the adored daughter. I was the daughter they could use as a buffer, a spare wheel they kept in the trunk, and only remembered when something went wrong. There's one Christmas memory that still cuts sharply. I was 10, small, fragile, too thin for my age, though no one ever commented. We had been decorating the tree when I suddenly collapsed from abdominal pain so intense I couldn't stand. An ambulance was called. At the hospital, everything moved quickly, bright lights, rushing nurses, people speaking in medical shorthand over my head, and then a surgery I wasn't supposed to have. Later, adults would call it a mistake, a miscommunication, a rare procedural error. But the truth is that a surgeon performed the wrong operation on me, and I nearly died. Lana, meanwhile, spent that Christmas opening presents at home, smiling in photos with our cousins, posing next to the tree I had helped decorate before everything went blurry. When I asked, months later, why they didn't bring Christmas to the hospital, my mother only said, "We didn't want to upset your sister." And my father added, "You were asleep most of the time anyway." They said it so casually that for years I thought I was wrong to feel hurt. But that was the pattern. My moments never belonged to me. My pain never rearranged their schedule. My needs never outweighed my sister's comfort. The only part my parents seemed deeply invested in was the lawsuit that followed, because the surgeon had operated on me by mistake. The hospital faced a massive malpractice case. Lawyers came and went from our living room. Papers covered the dining table, and my parents whispered heatedly behind closed doors about compensation, damages, and security for the future. I didn't understand most of it. All I knew was that adults hovered around me like I was a fragile vase, not out of affection, but out of financial interest. When the settlement came, my parents' faces changed. It wasn't joy, it was something sharper, hungrier, but the judge's ruling shattered whatever fantasies they had. Every last dollar of that enormous sum was placed into a structured settlement under my name alone. I wouldn't receive any payments until I turned 18, and the majority of the funds were locked until I reached 40. The court's reasoning was simple. The injury was mine, the suffering was mine, and the future medical risks were mine. My parents were furious, not openly, but in ways I could feel. The air in the house turned brittle. Conversations quieted when I entered a room. My mother complained that the system mistrusted parents. My father muttered about how money isn't useful when you give it to a child who doesn't understand responsibility. They never said it directly, but I could sense it in every tone, every sigh, every unfinished sentence. They had expected to control that money. They had expected it to fix their problems. Instead, it became a wall between us, a silent, invisible divide that grew year by year. They couldn't touch the settlement. They couldn't borrow from it. They couldn't use it to pay off the debts piling up around my father's failing clinic. And as I grew older, I started noticing the resentment beneath their smiles, the envy lurking in my mother's glances, the way my father tightened his jaw whenever mail from the settlement administrator arrived. To them, I wasn't the daughter who had survived a traumatic surgery. I was the daughter whose existence held a fortune just out of their reach. By the time I turned 34, I had built a life in Seattle that felt nothing like the one I grew up in. My apartment sat on the 21st floor of a glass building overlooking Lake Union. Quiet, orderly, and mine. I worked as a forensic auditor for a medical insurance company, an unglamorous job to most, but one that suited me. I tracked down inconsistencies, chased patterns people thought they had erased, and followed financial trails until they told the story no one wanted to admit. Maybe it was poetic, or maybe it was sad. But uncovering other people's secrets had become my profession, just as hiding their secrets had once been my family's. So when Christmas Eve rolled around and a delivery driver knocked on my door with a glossy white box tied in gold ribbon, my first reaction wasn't joy. It was hesitation. The card taped on top, in my mother's handwriting, read, "Merry Christmas. Sweetheart, we're so proud of you. Love, Mom and Dad. We're so proud of you." The sentence felt foreign coming from them, like words borrowed from someone else's family. I stared at the box for a long moment. Handmade Christmas chocolates. Imported. Artisan. Absurdly expensive, the kind of gift they had never given me before, even when I was a child longing for gestures like this. For a beat, I wondered if they were trying to repair something, extend an olive branch after years of emotional winter. But then the more rational part of me, the survivor, reminded me that my parents only acted warm when they wanted something. Still, it was Christmas Eve. I didn't have the energy to start a cold war over a dessert. I set the box on my kitchen counter and tried to ignore it. Later that night, I drove an hour south to Lana's house in the suburbs. My sister's place was chaotic in the familiar way of a single mother raising two energetic kids. Holiday lights blinked unevenly along the roof. The smell of gingerbread and spilled hot chocolate greeted me at the door. Lana's boys 6 and 8 ran to me the moment I walked in, shouting my name, tugging at my hands. No matter how complicated my relationship was with their mother, those boys never made me feel like a spare part. They looked at me the way children look at someone who shows up, consistently. I didn't come empty-handed. I brought the chocolate box still untouched. "Your grandpa and grandma sent these to me," I told them. "But you two love sweets more than I do." Their eyes widened like I had just placed treasure in front of them. Lana shrugged, half distracted while cleaning up the kitchen. "They sent it to you. That's new." I didn't answer. I didn't want to discuss my parents on Christmas Eve. I let the boys each choose one piece before I tucked the rest away in Lana's pantry so they wouldn't devour the entire box before dinner. I drove home that night feeling oddly neutral, neither happy nor upset, just suspended in that familiar emotional distance that always crept in around my family. The next morning, Christmas Day. My phone rang while I was making coffee. FaceTime. The screen showed all three of them, my mother, my father, and Lana crammed together in my parents' living room. The Christmas tree behind them glowed with the same ornaments they'd had since I was a child, though I couldn't remember the last time I had been invited to decorate it. My mother smiled too widely. "Hi, honey. Merry Christmas." My father lifted a hand in a stiff wave. Lana didn't smile at all. She looked tense, like she had been dragged into the call. "So," my mother said, voice unnaturally bright, "how did you like the chocolates we sent?" I didn't think anything of the question. I laughed lightly, stirring my coffee. "Oh, I gave them to the boys," I said. "They like sweets more than I do." The reaction was instantaneous. The three of them froze, their faces draining of color at the same time, like someone had pressed pause. A full second passed. Then another. I frowned, lowering my mug. "What?" I asked, confused. "They're just chocolates." Suddenly, all three voices erupted over each other, shouting. Panicked, sharp. "You did what?" my mother screamed. "Elise, no, tell me you didn't." Lana's voice cracked. "Please tell me you didn't give them everything." My father leaned toward the camera, eyes wide with something I had never seen on him before. Fear, real fear. "Elise," he said, voice trembling. "What exactly did you do with that box?" I blinked, stunned by the intensity of their reaction. "I told you," I said slowly. "I gave it to the kids." "Why? What's wrong?" But instead of answering, the video call ended abruptly, the screen going black. I stared at my phone, heat spreading through my chest in a way I couldn't explain. Confusion, yes, but also a prickling sense of dread. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen my parents look afraid of something that involved me. And whatever it was, I realized with a cold, sinking feeling, they had not meant for that chocolate to be eaten by anyone but me. For a few hours after the chaotic FaceTime call, I tried to force myself not to overthink it. My parents had always been dramatic when it came to Lana's kids, reacting to every scraped knee or low-grade fever as if it were a national emergency. Maybe, I reasoned, they were just upset that I had given away an expensive gift. Maybe the chocolates had something in them, coffee liqueur, a strong cordial, something gourmet that kids shouldn't eat. I repeated those excuses in my mind while I brushed my teeth and laid out clothes for the next day, like mantras meant to quiet a growing, uneasy pulse in my chest. It was Christmas night. Families all over the city were asleep under soft lights and warm blankets, and I desperately wanted to belong to that ordinary world for a few hours. So I silenced my phone, turned off the lamp, and let exhaustion drag me under. But around 2:06 a.m., my phone started vibrating violently against the nightstand, persistent and shrill, as though the universe had grown impatient with my denial. I reached for it groggily, fully prepared to snap at whoever was calling at that hour, until I saw the caller ID. Seattle Children's Hospital. Everything inside me went cold. I answered instantly, sitting up so fast I nearly knocked over the lamp. A nurse's voice filled the dark, calm but urgent, the kind of tone medical professionals use when they need you to hear every word. "Ms. Hart, we have your number listed as the emergency contact for 2 minors." Before she could finish, I was already on my feet, heart pounding. What happened? Are they hurt? What's going on? There was a brief pause, paper rustling, footsteps. Then, both children arrived with acute symptom seizures. Arrhythmias. "We are stabilizing them now. It appears consistent with possible ingestion of a toxic substance." I think I stopped breathing. "Toxic," I repeated, the word scraping out of my throat. "As in poison." Another pause. "We don't want to speculate yet, Miss Hart, but we need you to come as soon as possible." I don't remember the drive, only the feeling that the world outside my windshield had blurred into streaks of red and green Christmas lights smearing against the rain as my pulse hammered in my ears. By the time I reached the hospital, adrenaline had burned through whatever sleep was left in me. The sliding glass doors opened to the too familiar smell of antiseptic and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. a smell that had always carried echoes of my childhood trauma. Hospitals were where I survived, but never where I felt safe. A receptionist directed me down a long corridor. My boots squeaked on the polished floor as I passed rows of closed doors, machines beeping in steady rhythms behind them. When I entered the pediatric emergency wing, a doctor in navy scrubs approached me immediately. Min. Heart. I'm Dr. Nguyen. The boys are stable for the moment. Stable. The word hung in the air, razor thin. They both presented with seizures and irregular cardiac rhythms shortly after consuming the same food item. He continued. We performed gastric lavage and rapid blood work. The initial tox screen shows traces of a negative chronotropic agent, something that slows heart conduction. My vision wavered. That's not food poisoning. He shook his head. No, this is not typical of contamination or spoilage. This is consistent with exposure to a substance used medically, not something found in everyday candy or groceries. Candy. The word punched through my panic. Wait, I said, my voice thinning. You said they ate the same thing. The doctor nodded. Both boys reported eating chocolates earlier in the evening. Expensive ones. They said, handmade. My stomach twisted so violently I had to grip the back of a chair to steady myself. Those chocolates, I whispered. They came from me. Doctor. Nguyen studied my face, confusion flickering across his. You gave the children medication. No. I snapped automatically, then caught myself, closing my eyes. No, I gave them a gift. A box of chocolates my parents sent me. That's all. But the room suddenly felt smaller, heavier, because as the doctor continued explaining test results, something inside me had already started connecting dots I didn't want to see. A negative chronotropic agent, a substance meant to slow the heart, a medically used compound, and my father, who had once had access to an entire pharmacy's worth of such medications during his surgical career. My father, who had trembled on the FaceTime call the second he learned the chocolates hadn't been eaten by me. My mother, who had screamed in panic before I even understood there was a problem. I stared at the hallway beyond the doctor's shoulder, where nurses moved swiftly between rooms under soft blue lights, and a creeping, sickening realization began to bloom in the back of my mind. The chocolates were never meant for children. They were meant for me. The guilt hit next sharp, breathless, suffocating. The boys? My nephews. They were lying behind glass doors hooked up to monitors because of something I had delivered to their house with my own hands. I pressed a trembling palm over my mouth, forcing down the wave of nausea threatening to rise. But I didn't say it out loud. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear my own voice confirm the suspicion forming like a bruise in my mind. Instead, I swallowed hard and asked the only question I could manage. Will they make it? Doctor. Nguyen's expression softened. They're strong kids. They got here in time. We're optimistic. Relief washed through me so forcefully my knees nearly buckled. I sank into a chair in the waiting area, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the dark window, pale, shaken, eyes wide with something between fear and fury. And beneath everything, buried but unmistakable, was the first seed of a truth I could no longer ignore. That chocolate box was never a gift. It was a plan. And I was always meant to be the one who paid the price. The hours in the pediatric waiting room stretched like wet wool, heavy, suffocating, clinging to every part of me. I sat with my elbows on my knees, fingers pressed against my temples, trying to steady my breathing while the monitors hummed through the walls. The boys were stable. The doctors had said, stable. It was a thin word, stretched to its limit. And while I waited for updates, my mind traitorous, relentless, began dragging me backward through the years, toward the very moment my life had been split into before and after. The moment when my body became an asset, my pain a ledger entry, and my future collateral. I was 10 when the malpractice lawsuit consumed our lives. I can still see that conference room in the courthouse mahogany table, stacks of legal pads, a pitcher of stale water sweating in the middle. My parents sat at one end like anxious shareholders waiting for dividends. Lawyers shuffled documents. Doctors whispered in corners. And no one looked at me, unless they needed me to confirm a detail about the surgery that nearly killed me. I sat beside a window, swinging my legs, wondering why everyone was talking about me without talking to me. My mother cried often back then, but not in the way mothers cry for their injured children. She cried in frustration, in the car, in the kitchen, in the lawyer's parking lot. My father, on the other hand, became something colder focused, calculating, almost energized by the fight. But when the verdict finally came, neither of them took it well. The settlement was enormous, a life-altering amount, enough to change a family's future, assuming the family ever touched it. But the judge, a gray-haired woman who had looked at me with a softness no one else in that room had shown, ruled that not a single cent belonged to anyone but me. The money was placed into a structured settlement that would release small portions at ages 18, 25, and 30, with the majority locked until 40. This child suffered the injury. The judge had said firmly, "This child will receive the compensation." I didn't understand the ramifications then. I only knew my parents' faces fell in perfect sync, like someone had drained the color and air from them. What I did not know, and what I would not discover until adulthood, was that there was another clause tucked deep inside the paperwork. A clause only my parents and their lawyer were aware of at the time. A clause written in tidy legal language that tied my survival to a financial trigger. If I died before age 40, unmarried and without children, the remaining settlement funds, everything not yet released, would automatically pass to my next of kin, my parents. I remember finding out years later, long after college, when I requested the full settlement file for tax purposes. I sat at my dining table in my tiny first apartment in Seattle, flipping through pages, sipping cheap coffee, until I hit that paragraph. I reread it 5 times. My chest hollowed out. It wasn't illegal. Not exactly. Many structured settlements included beneficiary designations, but it felt like a second surgery, one no doctor performed, a cut in a place no scalpel could reach. And once I knew that clause existed, I began noticing the patterns my parents had been weaving since I was a teenager. My mother's constant refrain, "You don't need that much money. Elise, you're so responsible. You'll be fine." My father's muttered complaints whenever financial stress spiked. If only the court had given us more control back then. Or the one he said one Thanksgiving, when he thought I wasn't listening. What's the point of money that just sits in a vault waiting for her? What could she possibly need with all of that? They always said these things behind smiles, behind hugs, behind birthday cards inscribed with empty compliments. Compliments that now felt like misdirection, sleight of hand so clean, I hadn't noticed the truth disappearing right under my nose. In the waiting room, with the faint sounds of doctors moving in and out of the boys' room, all those little comments echoed around me like ghosts. My parents' shocked faces on FaceTime, their panic, their horror when they learned who had eaten the chocolates, and the timeline sat in front of me like a clean equation. I was 34 now, 6 years away from 40, 6 years away from the biggest payout, 6 years away from the moment the settlement would finally become mine in full and permanently out of their reach. My parents had not said it aloud, but they had never needed to. Their resentment had seeped into everything for years. Birthdays, holidays, casual conversations. I had always felt it tugging at me like a current. I just never let myself believe it mattered. As I sat there, the pieces began to align in a way that made the fluorescent lights above me feel too bright, too sharp. My parents sent a lavish gift for the first time in decades. They demanded to know if I had eaten the chocolates. They looked truly terrified when they learned I hadn't eaten. And now the boys, 2 children who had done nothing but exist in the wrong place at the wrong time, were lying unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped steadily in the next room. My chest tightened until I thought it might cave in. They didn't know the boys would eat it. They didn't expect Lana to share it. They had only known one thing for certain. The chocolates were supposed to reach me. I pressed my nails into my palms to keep myself grounded. Everyone in the hospital around me was moving with purpose, saving lives, following protocols, doing their jobs. Meanwhile, the life I thought I had, distance from my family, safety, quiet anonymity, was dissolving at the edges. But even then, even as dread threatened to swallow me whole. I couldn't let myself jump to the darkest conclusion. I wasn't ready, so I sat there, staring at the blank wall across from me, forcing myself to breathe evenly, telling myself there had to be another explanation. The universe hadn't shown its full hand yet. There were still missing parts of the story, but in the deepest corner of my mind, a voice had begun whispering something I wasn't brave enough to say aloud. This wasn't an accident, and that box wasn't a gift. It was an opportunity. By late morning, after the boys had been moved out of critical care and the doctors assured me they were being closely monitored, something inside me snapped into a cold, functional clarity. I couldn't stay in that waiting room any longer, pacing circles around my fear. I needed answers, and there was only one place to get them. So I drove south toward Tacoma, my hands tight on the steering wheel, the winter sun glaring off the road as if the world outside had no idea that mine was beginning to tilt sideways. My parents lived in the same house they'd always lived in, white siding, blue shutters, the same cracked driveway I used to roller skate on. When I pulled up, the Christmas wreath still hung perfectly centered on the door, a picture of holiday serenity that now felt grotesque. I didn't knock. I walked straight in, the way a daughter is allowed to, though nothing about us felt familiar anymore. My parents were at the dining table, heads snapping up when they heard the door. Lana stood near the counter, eyes red, hair pulled into a messy bun as if she'd been crying for hours. For a moment, no one spoke. Then my father rose slowly, visibly startled to see me. "Elise," he said, voice thin. "We didn't expect." "Where did you get the chocolates?" I asked, cutting him off. No greeting, no pretense. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "It was a gift," he stammered. "A Christmas gift. From a boutique shop, you know, to make things fair." I stared at him. Fair to who? He flinched slightly, eyes shifting toward my mother as if begging for backup. She rushed in immediately, clasping her hands dramatically against her chest. "Oh, sweetheart, we're sick over what happened to the boys," she said, her tone dripping with trembling worry that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We've barely slept. But honestly, darling, you should never have given that box away. It was for you." The emphasis hit like a hammer. "For you." Lana sniffed loudly, stepping forward. "Why would you even do that?" she cried, though there was more accusation in her voice than concern. "Who gives away something like that without asking? They were your chocolates, Elise. Why would you think it's okay to hand them to my kids?" She was shaking her head vigorously, tears welling up again. But as she spoke, her words hit an odd, discordant note in the air around us. They weren't grieving for the boys. They weren't worried about the boys. They were furious that the chocolates had crossed the wrong lips. My father sank back into his chair, rubbing the side of his forehead with 2 fingers. "We wanted to do something nice," he said, almost pleading. "A small gesture, something equal. We didn't expect you to just give it away like that." There it was again. Equal. Fair. For you. A gesture. Not one of them had asked how the children were doing. Not one of them had asked if they were stable, conscious, safe. Not one question. As if their health was a mild inconvenience compared to the misdirection of that chocolate box. "So I'll ask again," I said, keeping my voice even only by sheer will. "Where did you buy it? Which shop? Who prepared it?" My mother waved a hand dismissively. "Some place your father found online, some artisanal spot. He wanted it to be special this year." But she wouldn't meet my eyes, and my father's fingers trembled on the table. And Lana kept repeating, "It wasn't meant for them. It wasn't meant for them." I stood there, letting the silence widen. My heart pounded, but my face stayed still. When you grow up in a family like mine, you become an expert at watching what people do instead of what they say. And everything they were doing now was wrong. Everything was a slip, a tell, a crack in their story. My father kept glancing toward the hallway, as if something incriminating were hidden there. My mother's voice quivered too precisely, like she'd rehearsed the performance but not the emotion. Lana's rage wasn't at the danger her children were in. It was at the idea that I had broken some unspoken script by giving the chocolates away. "Why aren't any of you asking about the boys?" I finally said. The room froze. My mother blinked. My father's mouth twitched. Lana swallowed hard, eyes darting away. "Of course we care," my mother insisted. "Too quickly. It's shocking. We never expected." "Expected what?" I asked. "Expected them to eat it. Expected someone else to eat it." My father exhaled shakily. "You're upset. We understand. But don't twist this." I stared at him. "I'm not twisting anything. I'm asking basic questions." My mother stepped closer to me, lowering her voice. "Sweetheart, we are devastated. But you have to understand those chocolates were intended for you. You shouldn't have shared them. You are always so unpredictable." Unpredictable. That word rang in my skull. I opened my mouth to respond something sharp, something final, but at that moment, something on the floor caught my eye. A small scrap of the chocolate wrapper. It must have fallen from the box before I brought it to Lana's house, or before my parents boxed it up. Torn at the corner, the glossy paper was printed with the artisan brand name. A brand I recognized. A place I knew did not sell chocolates in gift boxes, only bulk orders for custom clients. Which meant someone had ordered those chocolates. Someone had handed over specific instructions. Someone had chosen exactly what went inside. I bent down slowly, my movements calm enough that none of them questioned it, and picked up the scrap between my fingers. "What's that?" Lana asked. Voice sharp. "Trash," I said softly. "Just trash." I slipped the wrapper into my coat pocket, my face carefully blank, and for the first time since the hospital call, I felt something new settle inside my chest. Not fear, not grief, but a cold, steady resolve. Because if my family wasn't going to tell me the truth, I was going to uncover it myself. And I was done giving anyone the benefit of the doubt. I drove back to Seattle with the scrap of chocolate wrapper burning a hole in my coat pocket. The boys were still in the hospital. My parents were still lying. And the truth, whatever shape it took, was starting to feel like it was just a few inches beneath the surface, waiting for me to peel it back. I'd spent a decade working as a forensic auditor. My whole career revolved around finding the one misfiled receipt, the one irregular decimal, the one transaction someone hoped no one would notice. I had spent years following faint trails until they revealed entire schemes. And now, for the first time in my life, that skill wasn't part of my job. It was personal. The next morning, before the sun even rose, I grabbed the scrap of wrapper from my pocket and drove to a small, privately run toxicology lab on Capitol Hill, the kind of place that didn't ask many questions if you knew the right person. I pushed open the glass door into a sterile lobby, and a familiar voice called from behind the reception desk. "Elise." I turned to see Jordan, an old friend from college, now a senior toxicologist, blink in surprise. "Damn. Haven't seen you in years. I didn't waste time. I need a discreet screen run," I said quietly. Anonymous. No chain of custody reports. Just results. Jordan studied my face, reading the tension there. He didn't ask the kind of questions I wasn't ready to answer. Instead, he gestured for me to follow him. Inside a small lab room, I took out the wrapper and the small leftover chocolate pieces I'd retrieved from the hospital's evidence bag earlier that morning. "Can you run a full panel?" I asked. "Not just foodborne toxins, cardiac medications, antiarrhythmics, negative chronotropics." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "That's specific. Just run it," I said. "And please don't attach my name to anything." He nodded slowly. "Give me a few hours." But I couldn't sit still waiting. Not when everything I knew about my own life was starting to unravel. So, while Jordan processed the samples, I returned to my apartment, opened my laptop, and pulled up a folder I hadn't touched in years. Settlement documents, 2001. Hundreds of pages. I had skimmed them in the past whenever I needed tax information or updated statements, but I had never read them closely. Not really. But now, every line felt like a potential confession. The structured settlement itself was clear. Small payments at adulthood milestones, with the bulk locked until my 40th birthday. That part wasn't new. But buried deep in the appendices pages that were borderline microscopic in their formatting, I found addendums I didn't recognize. Ones that hadn't been included in the duplicate copies given to me at 18. Ones labeled with signatures that looked familiar. My parents. The more I read, the more something cold unfurled in my stomach. Years ago, long before I turned 18, long before I understood anything about finance, my parents had signed a contract with a private financial group I'd never heard of. They had effectively sold forward the future payout of my settlement. It was an illegal practice, a violation of court orders. But desperate people often made desperate, stupid choices. In exchange for a lump sum payout enough to cover medical debt, clinic loans, and their growing financial troubles, my parents had agreed that once the final settlement released at age 40, a significant portion of it would belong to that financial group. Unless I died first. I froze. The clause was written in sterile legal language, but its implication was unmistakable. If I died before the age of 40, unmarried and without children, the remaining settlement would bypass me and transfer directly to my next of kin, my parents. And per their forward contract, they would owe a percentage to the partnered financial firm. Everyone would profit. If I lived until 40, however, the company would get nothing. The forward contract would evaporate, and my parents would still lose the house, the clinic, everything. Suddenly their fear on the FaceTime call made perfect, horrifying sense. Suddenly my mother's trembling performance and my father's shaking hands weren't grief or confusion, they were panic. Panic that the plan had gone sideways. Panic that the wrong person had eaten the chocolates. My throat tightened. But there was more. Scrolling through recent documents, I found lawsuits against my parents' creditors suing for debts unpaid, notices of foreclosure, a court summons for my father regarding unpaid medical equipment leases. They were drowning financially. Everything was collapsing around them. And then, a final detail made my blood run cold. An email, dated 3 days before Christmas. The subject line, Financial Alternative Consultation Urgent. The meeting location was in Tacoma. The time matched the timestamp of the chocolate purchase on the boutique website. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding so hard it felt like a fist trying to break out of my ribs. This wasn't just greed. This wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a strategy. A plan built over years of denial, debt, and resentment. My parents had not only wanted my settlement, they had mortgaged it, gambled it, sold it to strangers. They had tethered their financial survival to the timeline of my existence. My father's career collapse, their debts, their desperation, it had all led them to a point where the only way out was for me to die before my 40th birthday. And then, as if the universe wanted to confirm the worst of it, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Jordan. Call me, now. My hands trembled as I hit dial. He picked up immediately. Elise, he said, voice low, serious. You were right to ask for a full panel. I swallowed hard. What did you find? A pause. A long one. Then, the chocolate wasn't contaminated. It wasn't an accident. It contains a pharmaceutical-grade cardiac depressant. A strong one. Prescription only. And the dosage is precise. Not lethal for a healthy adult in tiny amounts, but dangerous for someone with cardiac complications. The room tilted. Complications like mine, I whispered. Jordan exhaled. Yes, exactly like yours. I closed my eyes. The truth finally slamming into me with full weight. The chocolates were designed for my body, my medical history, my childhood injury, my settlement timeline. They weren't meant to harm random children. They weren't meant to be shared. They were engineered for me. And in that moment, whatever remnants of hope I had been holding on to, whatever thin thread of disbelief, I let it snap. My parents hadn't just resented the settlement. They hadn't just wished they had control of it. They had financially planned for my early death. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't an accident. This was a countdown they had been trying to accelerate. And the box of Christmas chocolates had been their attempt to cash out before time ran out. By the time Jordan's toxicology results finished sinking into my bloodstream like ice water, I already knew what I had to do next. Knowing wasn't enough anymore. Suspecting wasn't enough. I needed their words, their reactions, their panic. I needed the truth spoken aloud, not for closure, but for evidence. So I charged my phone, cleared the storage, enabled the automatic cloud backup, and drove back to Tacoma with the kind of cold, deliberate calm that frightened even me. There was no shaking now, no racing pulse, just a stillness that came from finally understanding what I was walking into. When I stepped inside my parents' house again, they looked surprised, but not surprised enough. My mother rose from the couch in a flutter of knitted sleeves, performing worry like an actor who'd rehearsed her lines overnight. My father stood slowly, face pale, shoulders tense. Lana was there too, eyes swollen, arms wrapped tightly around herself, pacing near the window. I didn't bother sitting. I didn't take off my coat. I simply stood in the center of the living room, hit record on my phone, and placed it carefully in my pocket. Then I said, quietly but clearly, "Why was there cardiac medication in the chocolates you sent me?" It was like dropping a stone into a pond. Absolute stillness followed, then ripples of panic. My father blinked rapidly. "What?" "Elise, what are you talking about?" "Don't be ridiculous." The lab identified the compound. I cut in. A negative chronotropic agent. Prescription grade. Something that slows the heart. I locked eyes with him. "Something you've prescribed to patients before." His jaw tightened, fingers twitching. "You're accusing us of poisoning you. That's absurd. You must have mixed something up." "The lab didn't mix anything up," I said. "So I'll ask again. Why was there heart medication inside the chocolates?" My mother pressed her hand to her chest as if personally offended. "Elise, sweetheart, do you hear yourself? Why would we ever? This is insane. You think your own parents would do something like that?" But her voice was too shrill, too defensive, too forced. I turned to Lana. "And you gave the chocolates to the boys." Her face crumpled immediately. "I didn't know." "Elise," she yelled, voice cracking. "I didn't know there was anything wrong with them." "Then why are you angry at me?" I shot back. "Why was your first reaction yesterday to scream that the chocolates were meant for me, not meant for your kids?" She froze, lips trembling. Silence stretched across the room like a knife edge. I took a breath. "You all knew. You all reacted like people who knew exactly what was inside that box." "No," my father snapped. "We reacted like parents worried sick about their grandchildren. You didn't ask once if they were okay," I said flatly. "Not once." The room cracked then. Lana let out a sound half sob, half growl, and suddenly the anger she had been swallowing erupted. "You want to know why we reacted like that?" she screamed. "Fine. Fine. Because you're always the one. Everything bends around. Elisa, you, with your settlement money. You, with your big mysterious future waiting at 40. I stared at her, stunned. She kept going, shoulders shaking. "You think I don't know? You think I haven't heard Mom and Dad whispering for years? If Elise dies early, the money goes to us. If Elise doesn't make it to 40, the settlement comes home to the family. You think I haven't lived in their shadow of what-ifs? Meanwhile, I'm struggling with 2 kids. No support, no savings. And you just get everything handed to you whether you want it or not." My chest tightened. "Lana, you think I'm privileged because of that money? The money I never touched. The money meant for my medical future, not your lifestyle." She wiped her face angrily. "We needed it more. The family needed it more. Mom and Dad just wanted you to—" She choked on the next words. "Say it," I insisted. "Say it." "Lana." She screamed it like a confession ripped from her throat. "They just wanted you to step aside early so everything could go back to the family, like it was supposed to." My mother gasped. "Lana." But Lana pushed past her, sobbing now. "I didn't know there was medication in it. Elisa, I swear." I thought she hiccuped, clutching her arms. "I thought it was just something mild. Something to make you fail your next health evaluation. Something so the court would review the settlement. The doctors would say you weren't fit, or you couldn't manage the funds. I thought they were just trying to shift the money. Not kill me," I said quietly. She collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. I never wanted you dead. I swear. But they made it sound harmless. They said you'd just get tired. Maybe miss work. Maybe lose your job. They said the officials would reconsider the structure. I didn't think. My father slammed his hand against the table. Enough. This is nonsense. You're twisting everything. My mother rushed to him, gripping his arm. Thomas, stop. But it was too late. The truth was already out. In Lana's tears, in their panic, in the way neither of them had denied it when she spoke. I felt something inside me go very still. So, I said softly, let me get this straight. You didn't think the medication was dangerous enough to kill me. You just thought it would weaken me enough to force a legal review. Maybe label me unfit? Maybe reassign the settlement. That was the plan. Lana nodded miserably. I stared at her. And you let your kids eat it without checking. She broke completely, folding in on herself. I didn't know. I thought it was just chocolates. I thought it was just something to slow you down, not hurt anyone. I swear, Elise, I swear. But the tears didn't matter, because the truth, once spoken, can't be undone. My father stood rigid, jaw clenched, refusing to confirm or deny. My mother's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. But none of it mattered anymore. Very quietly, I said, I'm done speaking with all of you. Then I turned toward the door, and as I walked out, phone still recording, evidence preserved, I felt the last fragile thread binding me to that house snap cleanly. There would be no third confrontation. Only lawyers. Only law. I didn't look back. I drove straight from my parents' house to downtown Seattle, hands tight on the steering wheel, replaying Lana's hysterical confession over and over in my mind. Her words were still ringing in my ears. They just wanted you to step aside early. Everything would go back to the family. But at that point, the emotional part of me had shut down. What was left was the version of myself I rarely unleashed. Focused, ruthless, methodical. The version that had built a career dismantling fraud schemes and exposing corruption. Only this time, the corruption lived in my own bloodline. At 7, 40p. I walked into the office of the only person I trusted to help me navigate the storm that was coming, Ava Rosen, a senior attorney specializing in financial crime and medical malpractice. She'd once been my supervisor before I transferred departments. Tough as steel, sharp as a scalpel, allergic to bullshit. When she saw my face as I stepped into the empty after-hours office, she didn't ask if something was wrong. She simply locked the door and said, "Sit. Tell me everything." So I did, slowly, clearly, clinically, exactly the way she preferred cases presented. I told her about the hospital call, the toxicology results, the settlement clause, the forward sale contract, the panic on FaceTime, Lana's breakdown, the recording in my pocket, and finally, the lab findings confirming my worst fears. Ava didn't interrupt, not once. She sat with her elbows on the desk, chin resting on folded hands, eyes razor sharp. When I finished speaking, she exhaled once, long and controlled. Then she said, "Elise, this is attempted manslaughter with financial motive." Her bluntness landed like a weight in the room. "And they're idiots," she added. "Absolute amateurs." They left tracks everywhere. I can already see 6 felony charges without even opening my laptop. I slid the phone across the table. The recording is time-stamped. Lana says everything except the words, "We did it." We. Ava plugged in her headphones and listened. I watched her face the entire time. Saw the exact moment Lana admitted the plan. Saw the flicker of disgust cross her features when she heard my father's cold denials. When she took the headphones off, she didn't smile. She didn't congratulate me for having evidence. She simply said, "We're going to dismantle them piece by piece." And we did. First, the toxicology report. Jordan had emailed me encrypted PDFs with lab signatures. Ava printed them. Highlighted key phrases: pharmaceutical-grade negative chronotropic agent, consistent with intentional adulteration, dosage risk heightened for individuals with cardiac history. Then she pulled up the settlement documents I had forwarded earlier. She zoomed in on the illegal forward sale contract, her mouth tightening as she read the clauses. "This alone," she muttered, is enough to get them indicted on fraud and breach of court order. We compiled emails, my parents' frantic messages with the shady financial firm, bank transfers showing lump sum deposits into their accounts days after signing the contract, time-stamped receipts from the boutique chocolate seller, and then Ava connected the final dot. A forwarded message from my father to my mother titled, "We need to fix this before January." The date aligned with creditor hearings. They were running out of money, running out of time, running out of options. Except one. Ava leaned back, satisfied. We bring all of this to the prosecutor's office tomorrow morning. But I wasn't finished. My nephews. The thought of them lying in that hospital room, tiny chests rising and falling under fluorescent light, pulled everything back into focus. They were innocent. They had no idea what poison lurked inside that gift. And their mother, my sister, had let them near it, because she trusted our parents far more than she trusted me. I swallowed hard. Ava, I want temporary custody. She nodded instantly. I figured you would. I already have the emergency guardianship forms. Their mother knowingly allowed the children to consume something that was later found to contain a controlled substance. She didn't administer it intentionally, but negligence is enough to file for removal pending investigation. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to take the boys from Lana, not out of revenge, but she'd admitted it herself. She never checked. She never questioned. She believed the narrative our parents fed her, even if it meant endangering her own children. Those boys deserved protection stronger than denial and blind loyalty. We filled out the documents together. Every line, every sworn statement, every explanation of potential harm. Ava scanned in the toxicology report as evidence and attached the transcript of my hospital conversations. When we finished, she looked at me softly, unexpected from her. You're doing the right thing. The next morning, we sat before a family court judge. Ava did the talking, her voice calm and lethal as she laid out the facts. The judge listened carefully, brows knitting tighter and tighter with each piece of evidence. When Ava played the recording, Lana's voice cracking as she said, "They just wanted her to step aside early." Something visibly shifted in the judge's expression. Then the hammer fell. Effective immediately, my parents and Lana were barred from contacting the children unless under supervised visitation. Temporary guardianship was granted to me for the duration of the investigation. The boys would be released from the hospital into my care. The world felt oddly silent as we walked out of the courthouse. No triumph, no relief, just the weight of reality settling into place. By sunset, I was home in my apartment, a small nest of pillows and blankets arranged on the couch where the boys now slept, tiny bodies curled tightly, trusting me without question, unaware of how close they had come to losing everything. I tucked a blanket under one of their chins and sat on the armrest, watching their soft breaths rise and fall. The room glowed with the warm amber light of my desk lamp. Outside, snow drifted quietly against the window. My hands were trembling, but my eyes were steady, cold, and unblinking, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the spare child in someone else's family. I was the protector, the witness, the one who would not look away. And the war that was coming, I would meet it head-on. 6 months passed like a slow, grinding season, long enough for the boys to begin sleeping without nightmares, long enough for me to grow used to packing school lunches and attending PTA meetings, long enough for my parents to be indicted, arraigned, and dragged through a legal process that stripped away every lie they'd once wrapped themselves in. By the time the criminal and civil trials finally began, the Hart name no longer meant anything respectable. Reporters printed headlines about a disgraced former surgeon, a retired schoolteacher accused of financial conspiracy, a family torn apart by greed. But none of that mattered as much as the moment I walked into the courthouse with 2 small hands clinging to mine, each boy giving me a brave smile before Ava whisked them away to a supervised playroom. Courtroom 4B smelled like old wood and institutional air conditioning. The judge presiding over the case was stern but fair, a woman with a voice that carried authority even when she whispered. When the clerk called our case, State of Washington versus Thomas Hart and Diane Hart, every muscle in my body tightened. My parents were escorted in by officers. Not handcuffed, but clearly under restriction. My mother's hair was grayer than I remembered. My father looked smaller, shoulders curved inward, as though the weight of his decisions were finally visible. The prosecution began their presentation with cold, methodical precision. The toxicology report appeared on the projector first. Charts, chemical structures, dosage estimates. The expert witness confirmed the chocolate had been intentionally adulterated with a prescription-grade cardiac depressant known for inducing bradycardia in patients with prior cardiac trauma exactly like mine. The jury listened in stiff silence as the expert explained how the same dosage was dangerous for a child, but almost certainly lethal for an adult with my medical history. Then came the settlement contract. Page after page detailing the structured payments, the 40-year release schedule, the death clause, and then the illegal forward sale agreement my parents' signatures stamped at the bottom next to the emblem of a financial firm no legitimate client would touch. The prosecutor circled one clause in particular. In the event of early death, beneficiaries shall receive full payout. Financial partner entitled to proportional compensation. My mother refused to look at me. My father stared at the floor. Next came emails recovered under subpoena, my parents negotiating with the financial company, discussing alternative plans, minimizing the risk of detection, a receipt for the purchase of the boutique chocolates, a pharmacy log showing a cardiac depressant prescribed under my father's old credentials months earlier. And finally, the recording. Ava handed the USB drive to the bailiff, who inserted it into the courtroom audio system. For several seconds, there was nothing but a crackle of ambient noise. Then came Lana's voice, raw, panicked, furious. They just wanted you to step aside early, so everything could go back to the family. You have a fortune waiting. Elise, none of us have anything. My mother's gasp. My father shouting. Lana sobbing. By the time the recording ended, the courtroom had shifted into a heavy quiet, the kind that feels like oxygen draining from the room. The prosecutor let the silence linger before stepping forward. Your Honor, the motive is clear. The preparation is clear. The method is clear. He looked directly at the jury. This was not a moment of panic. This was a financial strategy. My parents' defense attorney stood, smoothing his tie with shaking hands. He tried, desperately, to spin a different story. The medication had been meant as a heart relaxant. It was all a misunderstanding. My parents were frightened for their daughter's health, not plotting her death. They had thought the drug would simply calm her or help her sleep. They had never intended harm. They loved her. They were misguided, worried, overwhelmed. His voice strained with sentiment. The jury did not move. Then came the twist none of us had expected. A representative from the financial company, a man in a sharp suit with a too-still expression, was called to the stand. Under oath and under pressure, he spoke quietly, reluctantly, but he spoke. He revealed a secondary agreement, a private addendum signed only by my father. The clause stated that if, by my 35th birthday, no progress had been made in revising the settlement terms, the company would explore alternative methods to expedite beneficiary access. The prosecutor leaned forward. Define alternative methods. The representative swallowed hard. It was implied. Implied how? He hesitated. That the matter might be resolved. Prematurely. Prematurely meaning a whisper. Through Elise Hart's early death, gasps scattered through the courtroom like breaking glass. My father jolted up from his seat. That was not the agreement. He shouted. I didn't. The judge struck her gavel. Sit down, Mr. Hart. But the truth was already carved into the air. Lana was next on the witness stand. Trembling as she took the oath, she confessed everything, the lies she had believed, the manipulation she had fallen for, the fantasy my parents had woven around her that the settlement money would save the family once I was relieved of the burden. She admitted she thought the drug was mild, not lethal. She admitted she allowed her children to eat the chocolates without checking. The jurors stared at her with horrified disbelief. One of them whispered, "She let the kids get to it first." Another shook their head, jaw tight. Lana broke into sobs. I didn't know. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know. When she finished, the prosecutor called me to the stand. I stood, feeling as though the courtroom itself were holding its breath. My palms were steady. My heart, a heart that had once been cut open, unnecessarily beat with a quiet resolve. And when I looked at my parents, I saw no remorse, only fear of the consequences catching up to them. The prosecutor asked me to speak. I lifted my chin, stared directly at the people who had raised me, and said, I lived my whole life with the consequences of a medical mistake that almost killed me at 10 years old. The court tried to protect me. They gave me a settlement so I could survive whatever future my damaged heart would bring. But my parents didn't see protection. They saw opportunity. They saw money that didn't belong to them. And they turned that protection into a weapon they aimed at me. They tried to kill me with the very thing meant to keep me alive. My voice didn't shake. Not once. And that, I said, locking eyes with my father, is how you tried to kill me a second time. He looked away. The courtroom was silent. Completely, devastatingly silent. And the trial moved toward its inevitable end. The verdict came down 3 weeks after the trial ended, though it felt as though time had suspended itself in those days. Every morning I woke up before the alarm, checked on the boys sleeping peacefully in their shared room, brewed coffee, packed lunches, and tried to pretend our lives were not orbiting around a final act of judgment that would permanently redefine what family meant for all of us. But when the judge finally entered the courtroom that morning, the atmosphere changed. There was no suspense left, no mystery. The truth had already stripped everyone bare. My father was sentenced first. The judge read each charge slowly. Deliberately conspiracy to commit bodily harm, attempted manslaughter, fraudulent financial dealings, violation of court-ordered settlement structures, collusion with external financial entities. His actions were methodical, intentional, and financially motivated. The law had no mercy for that combination. He received a multi-year prison sentence, not life, but long enough that he would not see freedom while still young enough to reclaim anything he had lost. The courtroom murmured, but he showed no outrage, no collapse, just a stunned, hollow silence as though he'd finally realized the full shape of what he had done. My mother's sentencing was quieter, though not softer. She was charged with complicity, fraud, and aiding the concealment of an unlawful financial agreement. Her role was not as directly violent as my father's, but she had knowingly signed documents, knowingly lied, knowingly participated in the scheme. Her punishment was less severe, several years, with possibility of early release, but it was still prison, still separation, still consequence. Still the legal recognition that a mother trying to protect her family did not excuse orchestrating the downfall of one child to uplift another. Lana's judgment came last. She was not charged with the intent to harm because the evidence showed she truly didn't know the chocolates were poisoned, but that ignorance came at a cost. The judge reprimanded her harshly for negligence, emotional volatility, and the reckless endangerment of her own children. There was no prison sentence, but she was ordered into mandatory therapy, parenting classes, and supervised visitation with the boys for the foreseeable future. For the first time, I saw her cry not from fear, but from the weight of losing what mattered to her most. Yet even as I watched her break down, I couldn't forget the moment she had screamed at me that the family needed the money more than I did. Brokenness did not erase accountability. When the criminal sentences concluded, the courtroom shifted into the civil proceeding regarding the settlement. The judge reviewed the documents, the illegal forward sale contract, the clauses my parents had manipulated, the financial risks created by their actions. And then, with a firm stroke of her pen, she modified the terms permanently. My parents were removed entirely from the list of potential beneficiaries. If anything ever happened to me, if my heart faltered or my life ended before the age of 40, the remaining settlement funds would no longer be absorbed back into the hands that tried to profit from my death. Instead, everything would be redirected into a trust for the boys and for young victims of medical malpractice across the state. Pain would no longer circulate through our family like a poisoned inheritance. It would end here. When the final gavel fell, I exhaled so deeply it felt like the first full breath of my adult life. Becoming the boys' permanent guardian was less an announcement and more a natural transition. They had already been living with me since the night of the hospital call. They already knew the walk to their new school, the scent of my laundry detergent, the way I always burned the first pancake in every batch. I had learned how to braid hair for the younger one's stuffed animal because he wanted to copy you, Aunt Elise. Even though I had never braided anyone's hair except my own, we had built routines, bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes, morning affirmations taped to the bathroom mirror. What began as emergency care became a steady rhythm. The guardianship hearing was brief. The judge asked the boys where they wanted to live. The older one squeezed my hand and said, "With Aunt Elise. She makes pancakes even when she burns them." The younger one simply leaned his head against my arm. Lana wept quietly but did not object. And just like that, I became not the spare aunt, not the outsider, but the person responsible for their future. That night, after the courthouse emptied and we returned home, I found them curled up on the couch under a blanket, the soft glow of string lights flickering against their faces. The younger one, always more sensitive, looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. "Aunt Elise," he whispered, "is it our fault? 'Cause we ate the chocolates. Does Mom hate us?" The question hit harder than any testimony I'd heard in that courtroom. I knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Hey," I said softly, "look at me." His eyes lifted. "Something terrible happened, but none of it, not one piece of it, is your fault." "But Mom," he murmured. "Your mom is fighting her own battles," I said gently. "But listen to me. You are loved. You are safe. And what happened to you is not because you did something wrong. You two are the reason I will never be the person I was before all this." My voice cracked. But I didn't look away. "I choose you. And you get to choose your family too. Family isn't who shares your DNA, it's who protects you, who shows up, who never uses love as a weapon." He wrapped his arms around my neck, small and warm and trembling. The older one followed, hugging me tight from the side. And for a moment the world felt both unbearably heavy and beautifully clear. In the quiet glow of that living room, with the boys breathing softly against me, I realized something. The Hart family story hadn't ended in that courtroom. It had ended here, in the place where a new one was beginning. 8 years passed in the quiet, steady way that healing often does, not in dramatic waves, not in cinematic crescendos, but in small, consistent acts of choosing differently, choosing safety, choosing truth, choosing love that didn't come with fine print. The boys grew taller, their cheeks losing the round softness of childhood, their laughter gaining a depth shaped by survival and hope. Our little family, patched together by tragedy, strengthened by choice, built itself one day at a time. By the time one of them turned 18, he handed me a college acceptance letter with the university's crest stamped proudly across the top. "Law," he said, a shy, steady pride in his voice. "I want to help kids who get hurt, kids who don't know what's happening to them, kids like we were." And for a moment, I couldn't speak, because the universe has a way of turning broken things into something purposeful when given enough time to breathe. The younger one found his path too, a love for biomedical design and pediatric care. The day he told me he wanted to work with children who'd suffered medical trauma, I felt something in my chest shift. Not pain, not sorrow, something softer, something like the sensation of a wound closing for good. "Because of everything," he said quietly, "I want to help kids who make it through, because we made it through." I hugged him the way I never let myself hug anyone before all this happened, fully, without fear of breaking. As for me, 40 arrived, not like a threat, but like a sunrise. I had built a life that was no longer shaped around fear or obligation. I had moved up within my company until I reached a position I once thought belonged only to other people. Director of Forensic Analysis for Healthcare and Fraud Prevention. Later, I founded a nonprofit organization that combined legal advocacy with medical finance literacy, dedicated to helping families navigate the same systems that once swallowed mine whole. People called it meaningful, healing, important. Maybe it was, but to me, it was simply necessary, a way of turning my past into something that couldn't be weaponized against me ever again. My parents never reached out from prison. Not once. Not after their release. Not after all the years that followed. I think they understood that the cost of what they'd done wasn't just legal, it was relational, soul deep. Some things cannot be repaired, and some people will choose denial over redemption every time. I let go of the anger long before they walked free. Not for them, for myself. Hatred would have tied me to them as tightly as obedience once had. But forgiveness didn't belong to them either, not as a gift, not as absolution. My freedom came from finally accepting that I owed them nothing, not explanations, not reconciliation, not access. The invisible contract of my childhood, the one that said children must sacrifice, must excuse, must endure, was void. Legally, emotionally, spiritually, and once I tore it up, I never allowed anyone to draft a new one for me again. Most of the time, I didn't think about the chocolates anymore. They became a distant echo, the shadow of a story I no longer entered. But sometimes on cold nights when the house was quiet and the boys were asleep in their rooms, I remembered the sound of that FaceTime call cutting out, my father's panic, my mother's shrill gasp. The moment I realized the gift was not a gift at all. That memory no longer scared me. It no longer hurt. It simply reminded me of how far life had taken us since then. And then came another Christmas, just the three of us now. Always the three. The apartment was warm with the scent of cinnamon and pine. The lights glowed softly against the windows, reflecting off the gentle snowfall outside. The boys, now young men, moved confidently in the kitchen, arguing about who burned the casserole and whether I would notice. We ate dinner at the small dining table we'd bought secondhand years ago, laughing at stories from school, pretending the world had never been anything but this. After dessert, the older one raised his glass root beer for him, a small glass of wine for me. He cleared his throat, glancing at his brother, then at me. "To the aunt who saved us twice," he said, "once from the chocolates, and once from the kind of family we weren't meant to survive." His brother clinked his glass immediately. "To the aunt who gave us a real one instead." I felt my eyes sting, but I didn't hide it. They'd earned the right to see every part of me, including the parts that still felt soft, still felt human, still remembered what it was like to be 10 years old in a hospital bed, wondering why Christmas didn't come. I lifted my glass. "To us," I said, "to who we became, and to every choice that brought us here." Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the boys retreated to the living room to rewatch an old Christmas movie, I stood near the window, watching the snow drift past the street lamps in slow spirals. The reflection in the glass looked older, steadier, but unmistakably mine. And in that moment, I broke the fourth wall of my own life, the way a narrator steps out of her story to address the ones listening. My parents sent me a box of Christmas chocolates to bind me to their debt and to my death. I said quietly, not to the room, but to the memory of what once was. But I sent something back into the world too. Not revenge, not bitterness, something better. I gave 2 children a chance to step out of a cycle that should have ended long before we were all born. I let the silence settle, then spoke the truth that had carried me for 8 long years. Family isn't a contract signed in blood. It's not obligation. It's not sacrifice masquerading as love. Family is the people you choose not to harm even when you are desperate. Especially when you are desperate. Behind me. The boys laughed at something on the TV. The warmth of our small living room wrapped around me like a soft shield. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't looking back anymore. I was home,